Welcome back, Internet. This is Driving and Dragons, and I'm your intrepid forever GM host, Daniel. Today is your turn, Game Masters. That's right, we're following up on the last You're Doing It Wrong video about writing backstories, and now we're coming for the DMs, GMs, referees, storytellers, keepers, tall tellers, and whatever else you guys who run games are calling yourselves these days. In the video, we continue the quest to remove the broken EGR stud from the Z-car. For those following, next up on the restoration list are the brakes, including a rear disc conversion, the HVAC system because it's 100 degrees outside in Alabama and I may as well fix the heat while I'm at it, a few more smog deletes such as charcoal canister and unnecessary vacuum lines, then a full exhaust from headers all the way back to tailpipe, and we'll cap off mechanicals with a fuel rail replacement and potentially pulling the head and sending it off for a port and polish while I replace injectors in the valve body. Some of that stuff isn't strictly needed, but I may as well do it while I'm tearing things apart to get a little bit more performance, a little bit more efficiency, and a little bit more life before I got to do more to the car. Moving on to TTRPGs. I'm opening this episode with a disclaimer. If you don't play in a narrative-driven game, most of this and most of the last video aren't really in your wheelhouse. Simulationists and gamer tables typically have very, very little need for backstory, if any need at all, and as a general rule, most of these kinds of tables need one or two sentences. These are very prevalent playstyles in the OSR and among older gamers in general, so grognards, there's no need for, I just don't see a need for a backstory, or I use backstory as kindling to start my fires type comments. Leave those comments in the comment section anyway. I'm aiming for 1,000 subs by Christmas and the algorithm needs to be fed, but just to be honest, it's like we understand if you're running a purely simulationist game, you don't really need a backstory, and if you're treating this like an MMO, you really don't need a backstory. So, how is it that we, as GMs, are doing it wrong when it comes to using character backstories in our games and setting up players for how they're going to craft their backstories? Well, let's take this the same way we did with the players and hit those top 6. After all, what's good for the goose is good for the grognard. At least I think's how that saying goes. Number 1, bearing the lead. This is a journalism term. It means that you hide or obscure the headline or the most important part of a story deep in the text. A very easy example of this is when an organization like the New York Times writes 23 paragraphs about how something is being overblown and how this situation is on all the far-right conspiracy sites. Then they only point out down in paragraph 24 after 10,000 words that the story is in fact completely true and was confirmed on the ground by news agencies that are anything but right-wing or may even be their own reporters. The part that we all find important about their article is, hey, something serious is happening. That's buried somewhere deep in the story while they try to slant your opinion of it before they ever get to it. We as game masters do this, but we do it in a far less nefarious way, and it's the same thing that our players frustrate us by doing. We give them all this extraneous detail about the game world and the kind of game we're going to be running, only to leave out something important like elves are inherently evil in this world, or you will be working on the side of the Empire. We may mention it somewhere, but it's buried deep in our lore page that we sent out, or deep in our pitch that they're, already goofing off on their phone by the time we get to it. Imagine if you were playing a Dragonlance game set in the Age of Despair, and you didn't bother to mention, or you only kind of offhand mentioned in the bottom, somewhere that clerics basically don't exist, and when they do, it's as charlatans and heretics with no powers or ties to any of the real gods. Can you see where a player might get a bit miffed when they hand you their orphan raised by kindly clerics of Paladine in a well-established monastery? How about if they give you a cyberpunk character who's militantly opposed to drug use and has a personal crusade to rid Night City of the street drugs that claim their families' lives, and you neglected the whole part about how your entire campaign is them being drug runners for a cartel that's making a push to join the megacorps? This isn't to say you can't have a plot twist or a surprise in your game. Those are pretty important for making a compelling story. but you don't bury or leave out key important details that set your players up for frustration. That leads me to a second major mistake. Number 2, skipping the interview. This is when you just throw out a primer for a campaign and turn your players loose to make backstories. Even if you don't bury the lead on them, this is where your plot twists or the parts that you need to keep a surprise can become an issue. You need to have a short conversation with the players and let them pitch their character to you before they develop their backstory. Sometimes you can even do this as a group, kind of like a pre-session 0. And it can lead to 2 players working together as an added bonus, like when 2 players in my Cyberpunk Red game rolled a backstory element that they had lost or missing family members, and they decided, hey, we can be each other's lost sibling and not know about it. Right offhand, I've got some cool stuff I can do, and I've got 2 players working together and invested. That possible benefit aside, if you have that player who's coming to you saying, I'm thinking I'll run a paladin because I was an orphan raised by clerics, but I also feel the need to protect children from the evil that befell my parents, that's a good time for you to say, I'm not sure a paladin will really work in this game. Maybe just a morally righteous fighter. Because you know that the big twist is that it turns out the major good deity in your world is just the evil deity in disguise, and that paladin will lose all their powers. Or perhaps it's more a fair warning kind of thing, and you need to say, look, just be aware that a rocker boy is all about their fan base and getting people to do stuff for them, and the game we're playing is not going to be hanging around Night City. This not only tells them that the character might have abilities that get hamstrung, but it also points out that if they go with the whole underground rapper fighting for the good of his rundown neighborhood backstory, it may not work because they're leaving Night City and thus his neighborhood. Perhaps he should be more the kind who wants to leave 8 Mile in his rearview mirror. It is far less frustrating to have that change of story occur with a 5-minute conversation as opposed to after they spent time writing up and getting excited about a backstory they might have spent hours on. Number 3 is not setting expectations. If you aren't reading more than a page, tell your players you aren't reading more than a page before they write 3 or 4 pages. If you only want a 2-sentence blurb, tell your players, hey, 2-3 sentences tops. I just want the elevator pitch. Do you want a 5 or 6 bullet point list of specific things? Make sure your players know that. Lay your parameters out and ask for the info that you need. And if you don't do that, and they hand you a novella, you're kind of obligated to read it now. Consider it your penance for failing in the Game Master's prime duty, which is running the game. And that includes the parts of the game that are not rolling dice during a game session. You also asked for it when they hand you a blank page that gives you nothing to work with. Now, on the flip side, if you tell your players, I need some basics about your past and why you're adventuring, but I'm not reading more than a page, then they have no right to bitch when you quote-unquote missed something that they had buried on page 4, paragraph 7 of their backstory. Number 4, not looking for common threads. This is the first real tip on using backstories actually in the game and as part of your prep. You have 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 backstories to deal with. Most of the players want to see their backstory come to the front at some point. The issue is, with 4 or 5 people to give their time to shine, the urge to simply shoehorn in something from each one of those people is pretty strong. The problem is, everyone can generally tell when you're plugging something in that is designed to make someone else shine, and a lot of times this leaves them feeling like, well, we all know who this session is for. What I suggest is you pull a few key notes from each backstory, see which ones you can work together as a common thread. For instance, the ganger who gunned down Player 1's brother was also the thief for hire who set fire to Player 2's childhood home as a diversion during a robbery where he stole the missing data chip that held Player 3's lost memory engram that was part of a secret megacorp research project that Player 4's father was also falsely imprisoned for covering up. Oh yeah, and that ganger turned over a new leaf, went into hiding, and reinvented himself as a crusading city councilman who is giving the players missions to help expose a nefarious plot where that megacorp uses the city's poorest district as their testing ground for military cyborgs and drones. Now we get every single player invested in the same story by tying the different pieces of their backstory into the same story element, and they all feel like they're the ones getting the shine and they're the ones who are in the spotlight all the time because they're all working for their own thing. And then when the twist hits all of them. Number 5, don't play favorites. It's inevitable that there will be that one player who is just more creative than others, or who just happens to have a backstory that fits the campaign you've already outlined like a glove. Sometimes it's because the other players just went a more simple route, or they don't care as much about character development or backstory, and when that's the case, it's a blessing, because when everybody is excited and invested in their backstory, they're gonna feel let down or even hurt or offended when there's one player who at the table whose backstory seems to be the prelude to the main story, while they at best get honorable mentions every few sessions. In all things, balance. Try to find things in each backstory that can fit in with a major part of your campaign arc, and if that doesn't work, scale it back and just focus on the little things for each character instead. Speaking of the little things, number 6 is prune the roses. For a rose bush to thrive, you can't let it grow wild. You have to trim the dead blooms and clear the undeveloped sucker branches, ensuring your main branches get all the nutrients they need. Same thing is true with backstories, especially lengthy ones. Even if you get just bullet points, the chances are you're going to get more bullet points than you can effectively use. Let's say each character has 3 good backstory points to use. Well, in a normal group, that's anywhere from 9 to 15 points, depending on your table size. And unless you're blessed with this really long-running campaign that goes dozens and dozens of sessions, it's unlikely that you can even come close to working in all those points effectively. You have to go in and trim out a few key things and put them to use. My rule of thumb is 1 key actionable point and 1 flavor element per player. For example, I may take a dwarven fighter and pick out that he has a deep hatred of gnomes and that his ancestral homeland was taken over by a deep dragon. The dragon point will come into play later because perhaps an artifact from another player's backstory ended up in that dragon's hoard. But the gnome thing will just be something in my back pocket, perhaps as a key NPC he has to deal with despite his hatred, or as a random incident at a tavern where his disagreement with a gnome patron sets off a brawl. Like the player list, this is by no means exhaustive at all. And here's some of the honorable mentions. Encourage players to insert their backstories in meaningful ways. That's right, players have a responsibility to reference their own backstory as well. Encourage this. Before that dwarf in the last example goes into the tavern, maybe mention that you're near a prominent gnome community, or that a gnome caravan was encamped outside the side of the town. Now when they get to the tavern, you've given the dwarf player a subtle nudge to maybe ask if he sees any filthy, stinking gnomes in the bar room. Don't be a dick. This is generally cited as the rule that as long as you follow it, safety tools lose what little value they might have. In this case, it means don't piss all over your player's backstory. Don't make it the butt of the table's jokes. Treat it respectfully, or if all else fails, quietly downplay it. They may have the most hack, cliche-filled, cringe-worthy derivative backstory you have ever seen, but to them it represents effort to buy into the game you're running, and that alone deserves little grace. Remember that backstory is the character's perception of what happened. They think their brother died in the goblin raid, but you as the GM decide if he actually survived. As I've said over and over, player agency only means that a player has the ultimate authority to decide what their character does, says, thinks, or feels, not the results of those things. In backstory, they have agency over what they put on the page, not what happens off the page. If they say they witnessed their brother's body get hacked to pieces by the goblins, then sure, he's definitely dead. He can come back as undead. And if all they said was he was killed by goblins, all that means is their character believes he was killed by goblins. Maybe he was just unconscious. Or maybe he was working with the goblins all along and he faked it and got a cut of his loot later. On the converse of that last tip, don't arbitrarily change characters' backstory. If you want to change something in a character's backstory, have a discussion with that player explaining why and how, and change it together. Don't simply change something concrete and inform them you changed it later. If they say they were part of a street gang and you think being a mafia associate fits better, then have that discussion. Don't just say your gang was actually a mob crew. It is better to not utilize a part of a character's backstory than to send a clear message to the player that their creative effort doesn't matter. So what did I miss? Or rather, what are some of your favorite tips, tricks, do's, and don'ts regarding the use of backstories as a game master, since we all know there is an abundance of things to add to this topic? Tell me in the comments section below, send some friends over to hit that like button, and I'll see you guys next time.